Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the fifth and final day of the series entitled Journey Through Time. On behalf of the Popcorn Forum Committee, the Board of Trustees, the administration, the faculty, and the students at North Idaho College, we're absolutely elated at the attendance this week. We have not had a single program in which there's not been a wonderful attendance, and that's a challenge when you have 12 programs and 12 panels. I just simply want to say to you, we hope you'll be with us all day. We have this program at 9. We have another program at 10 with Mr. Confucius. That panel then for Mr. Confucius will be at 1 o'clock today in the Bonner Room at the Student Union. And then the program with Mark Twain, he will be present tonight at 7 p.m. at the Bonner Room. And as we close out this series, I also want to thank the associated students of North Idaho College because they are responsible for 26 years of funding the Popcorn Forum. We were fortunate this year to get some private grants and appropriations, but they are the backbone of this organization as far as funding is concerned. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Chris Aller, who is the Vice President of the student body. And let's thank the students for all the funding for 26 years.
Thank you. Now, how many of you can say you had dinner last night with Mark Twain? Quite the feat. It was the most interesting dinner I've ever had, I think. I'd like to thank the food service over at the Student Union building for putting on a wonderful dinner. We had Cajun fish and fried rice. Kind of a Confucius Mark Twain twist. So now is your opportunity to step back with me as we take a look at one of the great American authors and writers. A man who has written such works as Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and The Gilded Age. As the assistant professor of the philosophy and religion department at the University of North Dakota, Dr. George Twain is Mark Twain.
Steamboat a-comin'. When I was a boy, there was but one permanent ambition among my comrades in the village of Hannibal, Missouri, on the west bank of the Mississippi. And that was to become a steamboatman. We had other transient ambitions, but they were only transient. When the circus came and went, it left us all burning to be clowns. And from time to time, we had a hope that if we lived and were good, God would permit us to be pirates. But these ambitions all faded away. The ambition to be a steamboatman always remain. I can picture that old time to myself, even now, and bring it back to life and make it as real as it ever was and as blessed. I can see the town drowsing in the sunshine of a summer morning. The streets empty. One or two clerks sitting in their splint-bottomed chairs, leaning back against the wall of the Water Street stores. Their chins on their breasts, their hats slouched over their eyes, asleep. A sow and a litter of pigs loafing along the sidewalk doing a good business in watermelon rinds. 2 or 3 lonely piles of freight scattered across the levee. The fragrant town drunkard asleep in the shadows. Nobody to hear the peaceful lapping of the waves against the wharf. The great Mississippi the majestic, the magnificent Mississippi, rolling its mile-wide tide along, shining in the sun. Presently, a film of dark smoke appears above one of the points that bound the river glimpse and turn it into a sea. A Negro drayman, famous for his quick eye and his prodigious voice, raises the cry, "Steamboat a-comin'," and the scene changes. The dead town wakes up. Every house pours forth its human contribution. The drunkard stirs, the clerks wake up. Everybody goes running to the wharf. Men, women, boys, girls, cats, dogs, carts, and there they fasten their eyes upon the coming boat as upon a wonder they are seeing for the first time. And the boat is a handsome affair. Has two fancy-topped chimneys, a pilot house all glass and gingerbread, flag flying from the jackstaff, the darkest smoke pouring from the chimneys and the steam screaming from the gauge cocks. The captain stands by the bell, tall, imposing, the envy of all. He rings the bell, and the wheels stop, then turn back and turn the water into foam, and the steamer is at rest. There's a scramble to get ashore, to get on board, to take on freight, to discharge freight, all at one and the same time, and such a yelling and a cursing that the mates facilitate it all with. 10 minutes. And the steamer is underway again. 10 minutes more, and the town is dead again. My father was justice of the peace there in Hannibal, and I thought he had life and death power over everybody and could hang anybody that offended him. But it was my ambition to be a steamboatman. So by and by, I ran away. Said I would not come home till I was a pilot and could come in glory. 22 years later, when I was writing Tom Sawyer, I took time out to write about those old times on the Mississippi. I wrote for Mr. William Dean Howells, who's editor of the Atlantic Monthly magazine. I had written another story for him the year before, and he liked it, so he asked for more stories, and this time about the Mississippi. He don't pay worth a rap. But the Atlantic is an awfully respectable magazine. And its readers don't require that a humorist paint himself striped and stand on his head every 15 minutes. No, sir. So I wrote about those old times on the Mississippi. After I wrote Tom Sawyer, somebody asked me, he said, "Mr. Clemens, would you like to be a boy again?" I said, "I sure would. If I could emerge from boyhood as a cub pilot on a Mississippi boat, by and by become a pilot and remain one." Riverboat pilot is the only entirely independent human being on the earth. Well, I'd quit anything in a minute, even now, to go piloting again, if Madam would permit it and stand for it, which she, of course, won't. I started. The year was 1857. I started by admiring a mate on a Mississippi boat. He was huge and muscular, and his face was whiskered all over. He had a red woman and a blue woman tattooed on his arm. And in the matter of profanity, he was sublime. He would never give even the smallest order without sending it forth with a bolt of lightning, followed by a reverberating peal of profanity thundering after it. He would say, forward with the gangplank. Are you going to go to sleep over that? Dash it. Forward with it before I make you swallow it. Where are you going with that barrel? Take that barrel forward. You dash split between a tired mud turtle and a crippled hearse horse. I wished I could talk like that. But the man I admired most was the pilot of the Paul Jones, Mr. Horace Bixby. I laid a siege of admiration on that man, so severe that after 3 days of my most intensest admiration, he agreed to teach me the Mississippi River from New Orleans to St. Louis for $500 payable out of my first wages. I entered into what I considered would be the small enterprise of learning the Mississippi, 1,200 miles of it from New Orleans to St. Louis, with all the easy confidence of a young man. I thought that all the pilot had to do was keep his boat in the river, and I didn't see that that could be very difficult since it was so wide. It was 4 in the afternoon. Mr. Bixby backed the Paul Jones out from the levee in New Orleans, turned it upstream, began to plow past the other boats in the levee. Then he turned to me and moved me to the wheel and said, "Here, you take her. And you shave those ships just as close as you'd peel an apple." Well, I was afraid we were going to scrape the sides off all those ships. We were so perilously close to them. I held my breath, and I began to claw the Paul Jones away from the danger. When I had a good margin of safety between those ships and the Paul Jones, Mr. Bixby saw what I had done. He moved me aside in disgrace and flayed me alive for my cowardice. When he cooled down a little bit, he explained to me that the easy water was along the banks and the current was outside. Upstream, we had to hug the banks to take advantage of the easy water. Coming downstream, we stayed well out. That was when I decided to be a downstream pilot and leave the upstream to people who were dead to prudence. As the boat went upstream, Mr. Bixby pointed out certain things to me. He said, "This here is a 6-mile point." I assented. He said, "Now this is 9-mile point." It looked about the same to me, but I wished he would change the subject, but he didn't. He said, "Pretty soon, this is 12-mile point." And pretty soon he said, "Here at this, abreast of these china trees, we cross over. Slack water runs out." Well, after 4 hours of this, we went off watch. 4 hours later, we went back on watch, and Bixby said to me, he said, "Son, what is the name of the first point above Nolens?" Well, I was happy to be able to answer promptly, and I did. I said I didn't know. I said, "Don't know? Well, you're a bright one, aren't you?" He said, "What's the name of the second point?" Again, I didn't know. He said, "Don't know." He said, "I believe you." He said, "I believe you are the stupidest dunderhead that I ever saw. Why, the idea of you being a pilot." He said, "You're not competent to pilot the cow down the lane. What do you think I told you the names of all those points for?" Well, I said, I thought to be entertaining. Well, this was a red flag to the bull, and he erupted in such a display of the English language as I had never heard before in my life. But when he was quite empty, he said to me in the gentlest sort of way, "Son, you must get a notebook and write down in that book everything I tell you. All the names of the points and the sandbars and the towns and the bends and the towheads." And so I did. And when we got to St. Louis, my notebook fairly bristled with all those names. But it was all in the book, and none of it was in my head. Worse yet, when we turned the boat around to go down river, I faced a river I had never seen before. And it was clear I had to learn that troublesome river both ways. Well, I worked at it. Finally, the names began to stay with me. But no sooner did I get that knotty problem solved than another one came along. One day, Mr. Bixby said to me, what is the shape of Walnut Bend?" Well, he could have asked me my grandmother's idea of protoplasm. I said, "How do I know what the shape of Walnut Bend?" He said, "You've got to know the names just like ABCs. And you got to know the shape, too." Well, my memory was never loaded with anything but blank cartridges. He said, "If you don't know the shape of Walnut Bend and all the other places in the river, how are you going to steer in a dark night when everything else is blotted out and you have to follow the shape that's in your mind and never mind about the shape that's in front of your eyes?" Well, I began to work on the shapes. And just about the time that my confidence began to return to me, Mr. Bixby said, what was the depth of the river at hole-in-the-wall trip before last?" Well, I was outraged. I said, the leadsmen are singing through that tangled passage quarter of an hour, half an hour, three-quarters of an hour at a time. How do you expect me to remember such a mess as that?" Oh, he said, "You've got to remember it. And the depth soundings, the shoal soundings of all 500 shoalest parts of Mississippi River from St. Louis to New Orleans, unless you want to get the boat hung up on one of them." Well, I said, "I want to retire from this business of piloting. I don't have the brains to be a pilot, and if I did, I wouldn't have the strength to carry him around unless I went on crutches." He said, "Now drop that. When I say I'll learn a man the river, I'll learn him. Learn him or kill him." Well, there's no arguing with a man like that. So I promptly put such a strain on my memory that even the shoal sounding started to stay with me. But it was the same story. As soon as he thought I could bear it, he taught me a lesson on water reading. He said, you see that slanting line on the surface of the water there? He said, that's a reef. And moreover, that's a bluff reef. And there is a solid wall of sand below that, just about as straight up and down as the side of a house. If you were to hit that, you'd knock the boat's brains out. Well, I got so I could spot a bluff reef. And then he said, now a wind reef looks just like a bluff reef, except it's made by the wind, and there's no danger. You can take a boat through there without any trouble at all. And you can tell a difference between a bluff reef and a wind reef by instinct. And it proved to be true. I got to distinguish those reefs just by instinct. I had acquired a vast store of valuable information. It was a great acquisition, but I lost something too. All the grace and the beauty and the poetry had gone out of the river for me. All that mattered anymore was the useful information I could get from reading that wonderful book. And there never was a more wonderful book written by man than the river. But I still held pilots like Bixby in great awe and admiration. Well, there's nothing more wonderful than a Mississippi boat pilot's memory. Why, to know the Old and New Testaments by heart and be able to recite them front to back and then back to front is no marvel compared to a pilot's knowledge of the river. There was once a pilot who worked on a great New Orleans passenger packet with George Ealer. He was a fine pilot, but he was a somnambulist who would do strange things walking in his sleep. One night, when he was off watch and George was on, they came to the Helena Crossing, just above Helena, Arkansas. And the water was low. And the passage of the crossing was in a very tangled condition. And it was a drizzly, dismally dark night. So as not to embarrass that somnambulist pilot, even now, I will call him X. Anyway, X was off duty and George was on. And X had seen the passage, the crossing in the river more recently than Ealer. And Ealer was about to send for him to help him with the crossing. When suddenly the pilot house door opened and in X walked. He said, George, I have seen this crossing more recently than you have. And I think I can get the boat through her easier than telling you how to do it. Ealer said, I'd be much obliged to you. He said, I've been turning this boat every which way till she's coming around like a regular whirligig. Well, X took the wheel, and with just a turn to one side and then a turn to other, he steadied that boat. Then he stood at the wheel, gently guiding it one way, and then guiding it the other. He rang for leads. He rang to slow down the steam and the wheels. He guided the boat through invisible markings, peered into the blackness to verify his position. When he had crossed the final danger, George Ealer let out a relieving sigh and said that was awful sweet piloting. He said, I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. I thought I knew something about steering a steamboat, but that was another mistake of mine. There was no answer from X, and so George said, if you would hold her, partner, just 5 more minutes, I'd like to go down and get a cup of coffee. Well, a minute later, when Ealer was down below deck, biting into a piece of pie and comforting himself with a coffee, the night watchman went by and took fright. He said, who's at the wheel? Oh, X is, Ealer said. No, he's not, said the night watchman. And those 2 men ran up the stairs to the pilot house 3 at a time. And sure enough, there was nobody in the pilot house. The steamer was just whistling down the middle of the Mississippi River at her own free will. The watchman fled out of the pilot house, slammed the door. Ealer took the wheel and slowly turned the boat away from a towhead that it was about ready to knock into the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. Sometime later, the watchman came back, and he said, didn't that lunatic X tell you he was asleep when he came up here? Well, no, he didn't, Ealer said. Well, he was. He said, I found him walking along the railings of the steamer just like another man that walked the pavement. And just now, there he was, doing it again. I put him to bed twice tonight. Well, Ealer said, I hope he has those fits often. You should have seen him take this boat through to Helena Crossing. He said, I never saw anything so gaudy in my life. And if he can do such gold leaf piloting when he's sound asleep, what couldn't he do if he was dead? I took a measureless pride in the profession of piloting. I'm still, to this day, benefiting from that experience and that sharp schooling. I met all the different types of human nature that are to be found in fiction, biography, and history. That experience has lent a zest to my reading. Whenever I find a well-drawn character in a book of fiction or biography, I take a warm personal interest in him for the reason that I have known him before, met him on the river. But those old times are gone now. Even then, the glory days of piloting were numbered. The railroads had already begun to take passenger traffic from the steamers. Then the Civil War came along and for a few years just about annihilated piloting on the river. After the war, some genius thought up the plan of towing about 12 steamer loads of cargo down to New Orleans, towed along by a vulgar little tugboat, and in the twinkling of an eye, steamboating was a thing of the past. And now all that can be done is write about it, and that's what I did for Mr. Howells and his Atlantic magazine. He liked the pieces, thought they were realistic. He said that water in his ice pitcher turned muddy as he was reading them. Those are the pieces that he asked for after he published an earlier story of mine that I told you about called A True Story. It is really Aunt Rachel's story. She told it to me. And since it was the first of my Atlantic pieces, I thought I'd tell it to you today. It was summertime and twilight. And we were sitting on a porch at the farm. Aunt Rachel was sitting respectfully below us on the steps. She was our cook and a colored woman. She was a strong woman and a hearty soul, and it was no more trouble for her to laugh than it is for a bird to sing. This night, as many nights, we were teasing one another and teasing her, and she was just quaking with laughter and letting off peal after peal, and she'd hold her face in her hands and just shake with enjoyment. It was on one such occasion that I said to her, Aunt Rachel, how is it that you've lived 60 years and never seen any trouble? Well, she stopped quaking, looked up at me and said, Mr. Clemens, is y'all in earnest? Why, yes, I said, I have never heard you sigh. She looked me in the eye and said, without a smile in her voice, has I had any trouble? Mr. Clemens, I was going to tell you, then I'll leave it to you. I was born down among the slaves. I've been one myself. My old man, that's my husband, and I, we had 7 children. We loved those children just as y'all loves your children. They's black. But the Lord can't make no children so black but what their mother loves them. I was raised in old Virginia, but my mother was raised in Maryland. And my lands, she would make the fur fly. She would get herself into a tantrum, and she'd put her hands on her hips. And she'd straighten herself up and she'd say, look here, I want y'all to understand that I weren't born in the mash to be fooled by trash. I was one of the blue hen's chickens, I is. I don't forget, because she said often. She said one day when my littlest Henry fell down and nearly bust his head open and tore his wrist bad, and when the niggers didn't fly around fast enough to suit her and sass her back, she straightened herself up and put her hands on her hips and she said, listen here, I want y'all to understand that I weren't born in the mash to be fooled by trash. I was one of the blue hen's chickens, I is. Then she bandaged up that child herself. And so I says that word too when I was riled. Well, by me by, my old mistress come to me. And she said, we're broke. Got to sell all the niggers on the place. Oh, goodness gracious, I know what that means. Well, by now, Aunt Rachel had come up and was standing above us on the porch, black against the night sky. They put chains on us, stand us on a porch. They walk all around us, one pinches and say, this one too old. This one don't mount to much. And then they begin to sell them. They sold my old man. Then they begin to sell my children. When I cry, man hit me on the mouth and he says, hush up, you damn blubber. When they had sold all my children but little as Henry, I grab him close to my breast. And I'll say, I'll kill the man that touches him. Henry whisper in my ear, I was going to run away. Then I'll buy your freedom. Bless the child. But they took him from me. That was 22 years ago last Easter. The man that bought me took me to New Bern. By and by, the years roll on. the war come. My master was a Confederate colonel, and I was the family cook. When the Unions take the town, they made the master's house their headquarters. And they asked me, would I cook for them? Well, bless you, I says, that's what I was for. Sure. The general, he'd tell me to boss that kitchen. He said, don't you take anything from anybody. You just make them walk chalk. He said, use among friends now. Well, one day, when the officers was in the parlor, I went in to them. I dropped them a curtsy, and I asked them, since the gentleman be from the north, if they ever see my little Henry with a scar on his wrist and a welt on his head. The general said, how long ago since you lost him? I said, 13 years. Well, he said he won't be little anymore. He'd be a man now. I never thought of that. I always thought of Henry as being little. Well, the gentleman hadn't seen him, and they couldn't do nothing for him. But all this time, Henry was free and was a barber, worked for himself. And when the war come, he says, I was done barbering. I was going south and find my old mammy. But I didn't know nothing about this. Well, one Friday night, there comes into my kitchen a Negro regiment that was on guard duty at the house. And they was singing and dancing and having a wonderful time in my kitchen, and waltzing all around. And one was waltzing around me with a yaller wench and making fun of my turban, and I was just getting worse and worse all the time. And the band come in, and my, they was having a time. I said, get along with you rubbish. But they just laugh at me more. Finally, I put my hands on my hips. And I said, listen here, I wasn't born in the mash to be fooled by trash. I was one of the blue hens chickens, I is. And I see that young soldier, that young man standing over there, looking at me like he trying to remember something. Well, I just marched all those soldiers out of my kitchen like I was a general myself. This is about 1 o'clock in the morning before I got that bed. About 7 o'clock, I was up getting the officers' breakfast. And I was stooping down at the stove, and I had just got the pan of hot biscuits in my hand when I see this black face come around the stove and his eyes looking into mine, and my hand begin to tremble, and all of a sudden, I know. The pan drop on the floor, and I go for his right wrist, and I push back the sleeve, and I push back his hair, and I said, Bo, if you ain't my Henry, what you doing with that welt on your wrist and that scar on your head? The Lord God of heaven be praised. I got my own again. Oh, no, Mr. Clemens, I ain't had no trouble and no joy. Well, that was Aunt Rachel's story. Mr. Howells printed it for me in his magazine. And then came Tom Sawyer and Life on the Mississippi and Huckleberry Finn, and pretty soon I was a famous author. Once in England, I was called a great author, but I was sorry to hear my name mentioned with the great authors, because they have a habit and a way of dying off. Well, Chaucer's dead, Spencer's dead, so's Milton, so's Shakespeare. And I'm not feeling too well myself. Thank you. But I'm not feeling so bad that I won't entertain some of your questions. I don't promise to answer them, but I will entertain them. So if you have a question for Mr. Mark Twain or Sam Clemens, either one, I'll answer for both of them.
Your favorite written work?
My favorite written work is Prince and the Pauper. That's certainly Susie's favorite work of mine. She's afraid that everybody's always laughing at her father. And I didn't put any fun into The Prince and the Pauper. At least that's why I think I like that book best. But Huckleberry Finn's a good book, too. It'll be a great book. I don't care what people say. Another question, if you have one. Yes?
As you walk back into our century, are you surprised at the charges of racism?
Huckleberry Finn has never been accused of racism. Those moral midgets at the Concord Public Library in Massachusetts have taken it off the shelves, calling it rough, coarse, and inelegant, but they're never racist. I did get a letter from a librarian at the Brooklyn Public Library that said that it had been banned from the children's section. And she thought that was too bad. I wrote back to her and said I didn't think that was bad. I said Huckleberry Finn ought not be given to children to read any more than a Bible ought to be given to children to read. I still hold it against those custodians of my childhood that let me read through a Bible by the time I was 14. Nobody can draw a clean breath once they've done that. I don't think Huckleberry Finn is any better than Solomon or David or any of the others like Satan in that book. If people would just leave Huckleberry Finn alone, he'd damage a child here and there, but there'll be enough children in heaven without them. It's when they get to stirring things up that everybody reads it, and he does harm all over the place. Another question. Yes? What inspired me to write letters to the earth? Well, Satan inspired me to write letters to the earth. They're his letters, after all. Satan has gotten a bad reputation, and he needs somebody to defend him. So I just simply gathered the letters that once he was banished from heaven for a while, came down here and wrote back to his friends Gabriel and Raphael and Michael back in heaven about the old man's experiment here on earth. He said to them, "You won't believe what a failure that experiment is." He said, "Why, you can hardly drive these people into 1 hour of hymn singing on Sunday in church. And guess what? They expect heaven's going to be like that forever." And they think, of course, that in all these billions of planets and stars, they are the only thing dear to the Creator's heart. Well, he found that rather humorous. And so did I. And so he wrote back reporting on the experiment that creation is. Especially the part about heaven. He said these people have only one great passion on earth. And they leave that out of heaven altogether. And substitute for it harp playing and hymn singing. Yes, young man. Yes.
What did you think of the Civil War?
What did I think of the... I didn't think much of the Civil War. When I was a pilot, when the Civil War broke out, down in Norland. You know, remember I told you the pilot house was all glass and gingerbread. And the pilot made a wonderful target for the Confederates on one side and the Union on the other. So I went back home to Hannibal, joined the Marion Rangers, a Confederate irregular group. And I went off with them for 2 weeks. And I learned more about retreating than the man who invented it. And when I heard that Ulysses S. Grant was coming after us with a whole regiment at his heels, I went to my colonel and resigned after 2 weeks, and so crippled the Southern cause to that extent. Because after that, I went out west with my brother Orion. Yes? Do I have any major regrets about my life? I seem to have just one regret after another. But the regrets that I have about my life are nothing compared to my regrets about the human race, the damned human race. That's a great regret there. But why is it that we rejoice at a birth and sorrow at a death? Just because we're not the person involved. It takes a while, but eventually it sink in. Yes? Well, this man has read a little pamphlet of mine that I'm getting out. It's about etiquette for people who plan to go to heaven. You see, the rules are different than they are on earth. When you go to heaven, you let St. Peter speak first. Don't speak until you're spoken to by St. Peter. And don't begin any sentence with say. And when you go to heaven, leave the dog outside. Heaven goes by favor, not by merit. If it went by merit, the dog would go in and you would stay out. And then, of course, when you run across an acquaintance from the old world, don't inquire about the whereabouts of the rest of the family. They may be on vacation. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if we can, I'll break character and let you ask just one question without the interference of the Twain persona. I'm George Frine, and we'll be happy to talk with you just briefly about Twain scholarship. Yes? What actually got you interested? Twain got me interested in Twain. It's great stuff. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of programs that you can do presenting one work or another of his. And today I thought maybe it'd be fun to do this one on the Mississippi and the Aunt Rachel story, which nobody expects. People do know about the criticism of racism against Twain. It's erroneous, I think. It's misguided. I see Huckleberry Finn as an attack on Gilded Age racism. Actually, the Huckleberry Finn is 3 books. It's a pre-war book, The Question of Slavery. What do you do with a slave? Huck knows what to do with a slave. You help him get away. And even if you have to go to hell to do it, it's worth doing. Then there's the war period, the Grangerford-Shepardson battle, America fighting with itself, killing itself, brother killing brother. And then there's the post-war period at the Phelps farm, when all that foolishness about getting Jim free is going on. After the war, which is the condition of Jim, because he's already freed, and Tom Sawyer doesn't tell anybody that he's already a freedman, but people don't know what to do with him. What do you do with a freed black man? Well, the only thing Tom knows is to have fun with him at his expense. And that's about what the Gilded Age thought of blacks. In fact, the condition of blacks after slavery was worse than it was before slavery. And Twain is making fun of that. So I see it as an attack upon racism. Well, Tony's coming up here. He's going to throw me out if I don't go. But I will be on campus the rest of the day and ask you to come by and chat and visit. I'll be more than happy to do that. Tony, thank you.